Hello. Welcome to the webinar, ChatGPT, the Emerging CXO. My name is Naveen Krishnamurthy, Vice President Executive Partners at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating and presenting during today's session. Presenting with me today is my colleague Sriram Ramanathan, Vice President of All Things Digital here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. Now let's jump into the presentation. So Sriram, ever since OpenAI's announcement about the release of ChatGPT, there's been a lot of buzz about this model. You and I both live in New York, and when the average New York City taxi cab driver starts chatting up his passengers about ChatGPT, I have to assume that there's a period of froth, hype, misinformation, and even misunderstanding that we are about to enter into. And so the skeptical mind goes to a few potential areas of concern. You know, we've entrusted so much information and capabilities in the hands of such large language models that they've become quite effective, yes, but in some simulated everyday applications, these models are coming back with some interesting prescriptions for human action. And typically, we as humans are smart enough to look at these outputs and apply human intelligence to reject spurious results and iterate again. But you know, as we become more and more accustomed to trusting and using these models, are we setting ourselves up for unintended consequences in non-trivial real-world applications? And you know, some of these questions will continue to remain with us for a while, but leadership within companies have got to believe that once we get past these headlines, the landscape is a bit more nuanced. So let's talk about that landscape. Let's start by looking at how AI models have evolved and culminated with ChatGPT and GPT-4. Let's then see how GPT-4 is demonstrating relevance in manufacturing. And finally, let's hypothesize some prospective use cases across different industries. So Sriram, why don't you kick this off? ChatGPT and GPT-4 signaling a tipping point, an inflection in AI?
Thanks, Naveen. Well, that is what the media seems to be saying. You know, the Harvard Business Review recently called ChatGPT a tipping point. And in addition, many titans of the tech industry are calling this revolutionary. But before we dive in, I think it's worthwhile looking at how AI has actually evolved over the past few decades. So neural networks are not really that new. They were first introduced way back in 1960s, many decades back. But then there was a lull in the space for a long time, the 1990s, 2000s, which is when we started seeing an uptick in this AI space. But the first big tipping point was in 2012 with deep learning, which has since been shown to surpass humans in very specific tasks like computer vision, natural language processing, and so on. But since then, there's been a hockey stick growth in innovation in this area. And to understand how this has culminated into GPT-4, let's dive a little bit deeper into the different flavors of AI. So first, there's this broad category of machine learning, which includes even very basic algorithms, some of which I don't even consider to be AI. This eventually led to the genesis of deep learning, which I was referring to earlier. And at the same time, what was happening was natural language processing, or NLP, started as a separate stream, which was basically using a combination of deep learning and machine learning. But the goal has always been the same: enable machines to interact more naturally with human beings. And out of this combination of these different flavors that I showed originally, what we have seen is the evolution of large language models, or LLMs, as they're popularly known. And ChatGPT and GPT-4 really builds on these LLMs to offer additional capabilities. Now, it is worth noting that a lot of these labels are very nebulous and there are no strict boundaries. So when people talk about ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, GPT-4, generative AI, LLMs, people are using these terms somewhat interchangeably. Now, GPT-4 is really a large language model that has been trained on massive amounts of data, basically everything that's available on the whole internet. And it was originally designed, again, as I mentioned earlier, to mimic humans as closely as possible in language. But since then, multiple tests have shown that GPT-4 displays a lot of contextual understanding, a lot of advanced levels of reasoning. And in fact, people have done some tests and they have found that GPT-4 does quite well on many standardized competitive exams that are used to screen humans. And in fact, GPT-4 might be one of the first machines, Naveen, to truly demonstrate creativity.
Interesting. So not just numerical intelligence, but also creativity. Now, how do we use these attributes in the real world, Sriram? Because right now, many of us are trying to address what it's going to mean to eventually live in a world where 10 billion people are walking this planet. Climate change is a clear and present danger. And labor and management continue to contest their relationship, all in the midst of companies just trying to figure out what consumers really want. All this to say, Sriram, what does GPT-4 mean for the manufacturing enterprise as companies go after these challenges?
Thanks, Naveen. So this is a point at which we should probably start looking at some ways in which GPT is being explored outside the typical chatbots that most people are familiar with, how it is actually being explored in manufacturing. And one of the first areas I want to focus on is launching new products. Now, typically a new product development effort, for example, inside a chemical company would involve iterating on several steps, determining the synthesis method, identifying the reactants, all at an agreeable price point. And these steps traditionally have taken many weeks or even months and have required input from expert chemists. And this is where a few stakeholders actually integrated chemistry tools with GPT-4 on the back end, and now they were enabling users to provide natural language instructions, asking for synthetic routes that meet performance and cost targets, and GPT-4 is actually able to come back with answers. And so you can imagine how this dramatically improves product development efficiency.
Yeah, this is interesting because here you're giving us a window into how large language models can build value-added interactions with the research scientist and do more than just go fetch the best fitting research publication on a given topic. So that's interesting. But now that ChatGPT is scoring points in product design, are there applications for GPT-4 and getting these products more firmly and quickly in the hands of the consumer?
I think what you're referring to is marketing or time to market. And I do want to focus on the marketing and advertising space. So just to give you a feel for Coca-Cola, a good example, Coca-Cola spends more than $4 billion in advertising each year. And the reason they do it is because they are a truly global company. They have sales and revenues coming from so many different countries. And so they have to tailor these advertisements to the local culture, the local demographic. And what is interesting is that Coca-Cola actually went on to use GPT or generative AI to create this really fascinating advertisement where so many statues and art pieces in a museum come to life. And eventually, they went on to actually offer this as an open platform where you and I, Naveen, could go in, put some ideas, and the platform allows you to actually produce advertisements out of these, out of your ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting because this is what you're talking about is crowdsourcing advertising campaigns. Sounds like GPT could offer a worthy challenge to advertising professionals of today, Sriram. But I get the sense that this example or examples like these are not simply about popular science in advertising, correct?
Yeah, the benefits of GPT-4 actually go beyond this. And in fact, in some situations, it has people have shown that GPT is very good at understanding the nuances of human language. And this has implications for benefits and compensation where emotions actually play a critical role. Right? Cornell Industry Labor Relations found that in 2022, there were more than 400 work stoppages, leading to around 4.5 million cumulative strike days across all industry sectors. And so some researchers at Microsoft recently ran some tests, and they found that GPT-4 can understand the intent behind conversations, determine where misunderstanding lies, and even lay out strategies to overcome these misunderstandings. And in fact, there's a company called Ironclad that is already offering a GPT-4 enabled contract negotiation tool. And so you can imagine how this can dramatically improve productivity, especially in this era of reshoring, where this could be key to resilience.
Yeah, you brought up a magic word, Shriyam. Ever since COVID upended supply chains, resilience seems to have surfaced as a critical need, worthy of its own megatrend status among manufacturing companies, yes, but also perhaps all other companies as well for the rest of this decade and many decades to come, especially as we face the kind of geopolitics that we're already witnessing and the resulting reactions like friendshoring and so on. With that, maybe what we do is cast our sight toward the future. Perhaps we can think about a few what ifs that are still tethered to the foundation of megatrends and see how GPT could help us out and whether there are any critical hurdles along the way.
Thanks, Naveen. So, going back to some of the really big problems the world is facing that you were referring to at the beginning of the presentation, let's talk about three megatrends out of the many that are out there, right? Sustainability, resilience, and personalization. So, let's focus on sustainability. So if you think about sustainability, it is all about optimizing your current asset portfolio while ensuring that your environmental footprint actually goes down over time. And this is where there's this interesting case study from a company called Zapata, which is focused on the quantum computing space. What Zapata did was they combined quantum computing with generative AI to optimize financial portfolios. And what they found was they were able to identify these new optima that traditional solutions tended to completely miss. And again, now this is pre-GPT-4, but eventually Zapata has gone ahead and applied the same idea of using quantum and GPT-4 to optimize the production floor at BMW. And so you can imagine for a manufacturing organization, what this means is that GPT-4 with quantum could help optimize portfolio of physical assets and capabilities while ensuring that your environmental footprint goes down.
You talk about physical assets and capabilities. Now, for a manufacturing organization, labor is a key asset. So perhaps a key capability for a manufacturing company is its ability to hire, retain, and train and all sorts of things with talent in mind. Would you agree, Sriram?
Yes, talent management is becoming very critical in manufacturing organizations, given that on one hand, there's an aging workforce, and on the other, younger workers prefer to work in the gig economy. And so this is shrinking the talent pool, while at the same time, companies need to become more and more productive over time. This is a resilience issue, right? And so to become resilient, you want to make sure your operations are efficient, and more than that, automation is going to play a very critical role here.
Yeah, again, automation and productivity, those bring to mind robots. Aren't we already, though, Sriram, on our way to building error-free manufacturing facilities where we humans become almost an afterthought, the kind of lights-out manufacturing concept that you've written about?
Yes, robots currently are very painful to deploy, and this is one of the things we pointed out in our lights out manufacturing analysis, where so many of these automation of tasks were far out into the future. Now, why is that? The reason is because you have to write thousands of lines of code to program every robot uniquely, depending on the task and on the environment. And this is the reason why robots, despite all those advances, have struggled to gain traction. Now, this is where GPT-4 gets very interesting. Microsoft recently tested how GPT-4 can be used with robots. And what they did was, in simple natural language instruction, they asked that the drone, and mind you, this was just a simulation, they asked that the drone actually go and inspect a particular wind turbine flying in at a very specific angle. And GPT-4 was able to take these natural language instructions, convert it into a robotic program, and in the simulation, they were able to demonstrate that the robot achieved exactly what the researchers were looking for.
That's interesting. So, I have to assume that with drones being able to fly longer and longer distances, collect more and more data on each flight, this sort of capability could then be used to quickly and routinely inspect transmission and distribution lines for electricity systems rather, and oil and gas pipelines, roads, bridges, dams, and all sorts of other critical infrastructure, both in times of peace as well as in conflict, right?
Yes, I do want to remind you that this is a simulation. So most of the assets you're talking about, Naveen, are in remote areas. They don't have much connectivity. And GPT-4, as you might be familiar, has 1 trillion parameters. And we are far, far from being able to run this kind of a model on the edge.
Understood. So some midterm prospects, but also some interim hurdles in complex industrial settings. But what about closer to the consumer? Any good news for B2C companies with things like GPT-4?
Yeah, one of the key megatrends that's relevant to B2C companies is personalization. And this is important if they want to hold on to their market share. Now, the fundamental tenet behind personalization is on demand, instantaneous, and only for me products and experiences. So let's take the example of footwear, right? We have 7 billion people, 14 billion feet. Research shows that 60% of the people wear shoes that are not even a good fit for their feet. And this in turn leads to foot problems, posture issues, and even back problems later in life. And this is where there's this interesting company called Fit My Foot, where you take a picture of your foot, you upload it, and they 3D print your arch inserts for your shoes.
Wait, Sriram, I'm looking at the fine print and I think it says it takes 14 days. I thought 3D printing was supposed to make manufacturing almost instantaneous, no?
Well, that's the holy grail. The challenge is that even for the same foot, the left foot can be very different from the right foot. And so when you start considering these various configurations, arch size, heel cup size, etc., the number of combinations are absolutely mind-boggling. Now, why is it so hard to 3D print footwear? The reason is because you have to write something called G code, a screenshot of which is shown on the left here. What this program does is it tells the 3D printer what to do, which, depending on the project, can mean hundreds or even thousands of lines, very similar to robots that we were talking about earlier. And this can be a big pain, as you can see in this sample code here. But after all that, you still may not get good parts. As you can see in this figure below, parts can get warped, they can show stringing, and this is all related to the fact that you could have minor changes, fluctuations in speed, temperature, material type, etc. And so you need to go back, fix it, which means that you have to go back and rewrite that code all over again. Now, this is where, again, there's some interesting research that has come out. Italian researchers, what they did was they provided instructions to GPT-4 to write G code. And they also told GPT-4 that if you start seeing any issues like warping or stringing, you should adjust that code in real time. And you can see at the bottom there, the parts are near perfect in terms of quality.
I see. So I think what you've done is, Sriram, you've presented three interesting use cases in different industries. The first one in chemicals and materials, the second one in energy, and this last one in consumer. But having said all of that, what does this now mean for leaders within companies, the CTOs, the CIOs, the COOs? I want to bring us back to the stem of this webinar that started this whole conversation.
Right. So going back to the megatrends we were discussing, they all align with the different CXOs in the modern organization. So the emerging CSO, the chief innovation officer, the chief operating officer, and GPT-4 can start addressing routine day-to-day functions that used to be within the CXO's purview. But here's the challenge. CXOs really need to show their mettle not during normal times, not during steady state times, but really during times of crisis. Times when existing mental models really don't work. And GPT-4, despite its creativity, is after all trained on existing mental models, existing data that humans have seen. And so they really cannot create new mental models. Now, as the world becomes more and more risky with some of the megatrends shown here, CXOs will need to depend on their education, experience, ingenuity to solve edge use cases that are more and more likely to occur. And in fact, CXOs will have to bring their most creative muscle to the game, Naveen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what you're saying is, Sriram, the CXO's role will evolve, but what about the role then of the mid-tier managers, the entry-level professionals? Anything in the offing for those levels in the organization based on everything you've told us so far?
Well, I think CXOs are going to realize that it is imperative for them to adopt GPT-4 to remain competitive in their industry. But this also creates a two-pronged problem. For the mid-level manager, GPT-4 is going to make their job easier, less taxing, but then again, they're not going to get that chance to cut their teeth on routine but important challenges in the organization. And this is a critical step to becoming the most effective next CXO. And but for the current CXO, also this is a problem because there's a big question mark on the long-term succession plan.
I see. So CXOs will have to rethink how to shape their organization to balance both the short-term wins from GPT, generative AI, and things like that, as well as longer-term upscaling of their existing labor pools. Quite interesting, Sriram. So on that note, why don't we invite the audience to share some questions? I'm going to take this first question. The question says, are we extrapolating from your use cases too liberally, Sriram? Are some of these use cases going to continue to remain in the far future, or will we see these use cases quickly broaden and then merge with adjacencies to eventually grow and gain mainstream acceptance?
I think the answer to that depends on the industry and the use case. So some of the softer use cases like advertising and branding, they're a direct line from what has already been built today with GPT, Dolly, et cetera, et cetera. And so consumer-facing industries and use cases like advertising and branding are really going to see a significant traction within the next, I would say, couple of years or so. Likewise, product development, we have already seen generative AI, the early versions of generative AI being used for product design. And what GPT-4 does is really soups it up. So in areas like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and even widget manufacturing, in the next 3 to 5 years, we are going to see generative AI play a critical role when it comes to product development. But of course, keep in mind that bringing many of these products into the marketplace itself takes like 5 to 10 years. So we may not see the first products designed by GPT-4 in the market for a while. But things on the market, manufacturing floor are going to take a lot longer. I would say at least a decade or so. And this is because there are lots of challenges that need to be overcome. Preparing the data, building the right generative AI algorithms and training them for the manufacturing floor, shrinking them in size so that they don't need to run on the cloud using very expensive GPUs, and integrating it with other technologies like robotics and quantum and with existing legacy applications, which are, a dime a dozen on the manufacturing floor.
Thanks for sharing that prospective timeline, Sriram. Here's another question that's worth discussing, I think. It sounds like the benefits could be profound, but what do we need to give up in return? Just like we had to struggle through dichotomies that prior industrial revolutions have brought up, are we setting ourselves up for some unintended consequences? consequences rather in this machine versus human construct. A world with a growing population, but with fewer jobs to go around, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as you point out, Naveen, we have been in these tension points before. The industrial labor revolution was all about labor versus automation. The internet was, the courier versus email. And the smartphone more recently is all about the yellow cab versus the Uber. And I don't see this as being any different. More than loss of jobs, what is going to happen is just jobs are going to evolve. So far, we have looked at how this is going to affect the job of different CXOs across industries. But I believe we all will need to adapt. And that includes white collar workers as well, programmers, consultants, advisors, and people like you and me. And in fact, I want to leave the audience with this question. What does this GPT mean for you, your leadership, your organization, and your role?
Gentle prod at the audience. I like that. I also like what you did, Sriram, throughout this conversation. You first talked about the evolution of GPT-4, so we're all aware of the taxonomy that we're dealing with. You then illustrated 3 instances where GPT-4, generative AI, they've been explored in physical industries. And then you hypothesized applications for GPT in use cases within chemicals and materials, energy, and consumer industries. And you finally had a chance to also address a few thematic questions as well, which I think leads us to a few takeaways. First, what I gather is an inflection point in the way we think about exploring the many uses of AI on the manufacturing floor. In fact, could tools like LLMs, large language models, work as a scaffold upon which you can layer on other technologies like robotics, like quantum, like 3D printing, and then be used in product development, marketing, and other functions in new ways? Second, the critical need to have qualifications for the C-level is changing. It's likely to undergo a rethink. So CXOs probably have to go from being mere organizational stewards to organization reinventors. And third, I think the pursuit of business continuity and success will have to balance AI's rapidly increasing capabilities on the one hand, with the unique needs for which we ingenious humans will continue to be desired in the workplace. That's all interesting. So I hope this was useful. That concludes our webinar for today. This slide presentation recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we'd appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. Take a moment to check out our upcoming webinars. This has been a Lux Research production. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day or evening.